In 1830, a piece of legislation was passed called the Indian Removal Act. It was under the Jackson administration, and this act essentially said that civilized Americans could not live with Native Americans, that the two societies were not compatible. And the answer to this was that tribal communities and tribal nations should be removed from lands in the east and placed on reservations west of the Mississippi. And the argument was made that it was for the betterment of the non-Native settlers as well as the Native Americans themselves. The Trail of Death story really starts with a collection of tribal leaders who did not want to negotiate or talk about removal. Menominee, Papinwa, Black Wolf, a few others really were standing firm on their argument that they had signed a treaty that gave away some of their tribal lands and gave them a reservation in northern Indiana, and that they had a document that said that they could legally live there, and they didn't want to negotiate again. They didn't want to have to continue to fight for their land. And so their approach was to say, we're not going to do this. We have rights, we have a document, you've signed this treaty, now you're going to follow through on it. When the communities gathered at Menominee's village, they were led there under the pretense that it was going to be a council. And a council is meant to be a discussion. So they knew that the federal government wanted them to move west, and they genuinely thought that this was going to be a discussion about that, talking about what the federal government was going to offer and their chance to argue that they were not going to leave, and that they had this treaty that said that they could and stay here, and they were intending to do so. When they arrived, of course, that was not the circumstances that they were being called there for. They were led there under false pretenses, and they were led there so that their leaders could be imprisoned and they could be forced west. Once the tribal leaders had been locked in the church, the agents who were on the ground did everything they could to make sure that the Potawatomi couldn't return. So they brought together a group of volunteers to go in a 50-mile radius and gather all the Potawatomi that they could find, so they made sure they brought all the Potawatomi with them that they could possibly get their hands on. They also did things to make sure that the Potawatomi had nothing to come back to. So they destroyed crops, they burned wigwams. They really made the village community a place that could not be a place of refuge. If tribal members were able to break away from the wagon train, there would be nothing to come back to. To make sure that the people within the communities left, the tribal leaders were put in chains and they were put in the back of prison wagons, and they were forced to be part of this caravan against their will, knowing that with their leaders in chains, with their villages destroyed, the Potawatomi villagers, the rest of the community, would be forced to go on the caravan with as little resistance as possible. So making sure that the leaders were incapacitated, making sure that the crops and the village sites were destroyed, it was really part of the psychological warfare that went into making sure that people understood that their homes in the Great Lakes were gone and that they were not welcome, and that the federal government would not stop until they had all left. We decided to incorporate this part of the history into the visual that we were showing to visitors by creating a prison wagon and displaying some shackles that are reminiscent of this era. We really struggled with that decision because it is heartbreaking and it is hard to see. But at the same time, we have to remember that this history is heartbreaking and this history was hard to live through. So making our visitors a little uncomfortable, allowing that heartbreak to set in a little bit, is part of what it means to visit a cultural center where you're dealing with a culture that has been impacted by forced removal.
Having architectural elements in mind for Section 7 is, we wanted to create a lot of blind spots, if you will. A lot of unexpected turns. There's not really that many turns in it. but we wanted people to be surprised as they turned and were able to be face to face either with images of their ancestors or murals of the removal itself, particular artifacts.
When we were thinking about how to really connect visitors to the trauma that happens as a result of removal, one of the things we talked about was walking a mile in their shoes. And as we kept using that terminology, we started to think about what it would look like if we created a display of moccasins that helped to represent this community, because they had to walk that 660-mile trek. They had to do so in weather that wasn't optimal, and they had to do so with moccasins that are not meant to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles in. And so as we really thought about how that would look visually, we decided to try to do a wall of moccasins, something that was large and visually compelling right as you enter into that section. So we opted to try to have a set of moccasins for every 10 people who were on the Trail of Death removal. So of the 890 people who set out, we asked tribal members, we put out a call to make 89 sets of moccasins. And the response was overwhelming. We had well over 150 people reply who were interested, and we sent out kits, and people who had never made moccasins before in their life watched videos and learned and made these moccasins that now represent their ancestors, that represent this struggle. And what I love is that without any prompting, they came back. Some of them were for babies, some of them were made for the feet of small children, some of them were made from the foot of the person who made it. They had their grandchildren be their model, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to connect the struggles that our ancestors went through on the Trail of Death with our community today, so that they could have a little bit of ownership of that history and feel like they're part of this cultural center, because that's what it's really about, is ownership and community.
My name is Isabel Bonebrake, and I live at Father Joe Murphy in the Elder Complex here at Shawnee. And I'm originally from Kansas City, and my ancestors are from the Bertrand and the Curley family and the Bursall family. I have been sewing since I was a teenager back in the 70s. I learned, my mother taught me to sew, and she was very good at it. My first project was a little sundress that I had made. It was a little white sundress with little pink flowers and blue flowers. I learned from my friend Zarina Thompson about the moccasin project, and she said I would be a good candidate to make a pair of moccasins for the wall, and I felt like that would be, I would be proud to be part of that. I had a neighbor that had a baby, and so I measured and made that tiny pair right there to fit the baby. But I wanted to make a tiny pair because to represent some of the babies and children that came over on the trail. It means a lot to me to have my moccasins here in the Cultural Heritage Center display, to represent all the ancestors who walked all that long way back in the times when they were forced out of their Native American lands. And it sort of brought tears to my eyes to know that my Native American ancestors made it that far, and the things that they had to give up and go to a new way of life that they couldn't even imagine how hard it would be. And I just feel like it's my pleasure to be able to represent my Native American ancestors.
We wanted people to connect on a human element, on a one-to-one element, and what better way to do that through shoes. Shoes are very expressive to someone's personality, but they're also expressive in a way in which somebody lives, the path that they take, the way in which they walk, the activities that they do. So in displaying those, I think it truly identifies with those individuals that made that work or made that walk. But it was also a way in which we could create a collaborative effort with the community, that we could reach out, have them connect with that time period, with the goals that we had set forth for the gallery, but more importantly, connect with their ancestors. The moccasins that are displayed in the middle of the gallery are a continuation of the ones that you can see on the wall. Our goal was to display 86 pairs. Architecturally and design-wise, we weren't able to display all 86 on the curvatures in the walls. So what we had an idea is that we want to display them in small boxes, small display cases, but have them serve as a procession or a guide that would have helped lead people on a path similar to those of their ancestors. So where they're chronologically working through the narrative that we have displayed, but also the murals that you see on the walls.
The Potawatomi removal was fairly unique in that we had an artist who was actually on the ground when the removal was happening. George Winter was a British artist, sketch artist, who was here, and he, in real time, was sketching the removal scenes. He was sketching the portraiture of individuals who were on the removal. He was standing on a cliff watching this wagon train of Potawatomi leaving their homelands, for many of them what would be the last time. And the fact that we have that imagery, we wanted to take advantage of that, because so often we as historians and museum professionals are having to create imagery for a time period so that our visitors can understand what it was like. And this is one of those cases where we actually had something from the period, and we took full advantage of that by blowing up some of his sketches to life size and having cutouts of these individuals. And again, they aren't stylized, generic individuals. These are portraits of people who were on the removal and in the scenes, so that you can sometimes see the exhaustion on their face and the heartbreak and the sadness of the loss that they understand that they're experiencing. And to be able to have that removal scene of the Potawatomi train winding through the valleys and the scene of the Great Lakes is so impactful. And we knew that we had this great resource and we had to make the most of it. So we really were lucky to have that imagery from George Winter to help us bring home the reality of what this was like for our ancestors. It wasn't just the walk. It wasn't just leaving home. It was being forced to leave behind everything they had ever known and understood about themselves, and going to a place that they didn't understand and where they were not prepared for what they were going to have to face.
Choosing the imagery for the gallery is kind of tough. We have a wealth of things to select from, particularly from the works of George Winter. He was an English-born artist during this period, and luck have it, he was sort of in the right place at the right time with an established gallery near a hotel where removal proceedings were underway. He had established this gallery, and his first patron was a young Potawatomi man named by the name of Iowa. He came down, set for a portrait. Government officials were so impressed by this that they began to go in and have their portraits commissioned as well. There was such fervor for his artwork that he was invited to accompany government officials on treaty and removal negotiations in Potawatomi and Miami villages. So for a 2 to 3 week period, he documented individuals through portraiture, scene settings, through writings, of what life was like, especially prior to removal, but leading up to it, in sort of this tumultuous time.
George Winter was a prolific sketch artist. He was great because he did so many sketches in the field and then he would go back into his studio and apply color and refine them. But through the time that he spent with the Potawatomi, he had so much work that we decided to incorporate an interactive so that people could see up close the color sketches of some of these portraits, so they could see the clothing. We often have tribal members asking about how to make their regalia and sending them to George Winter, where he did detailed sketches of the colors that were used and the patterns and the jewelry that our ancestors were wearing. It's a real treasure trove of imagery from this time period, and we wanted to make sure that we made that all available so that tribal members could sit and spend some time and really get to know what this period looked like. Just like in the previous sections of the museum where we had to really think about what does the wall color say to our visitors, what feeling does it invoke in people who are walking through. In this section, we knew we had to deal with trauma. We had to deal with a brutal time in our history. And so we decided to go with this oxblood color because red evokes very strong feelings in people. You don't walk into a red room and have a neutral feeling about it. It makes people agitated. It tends to make people slightly uncomfortable. And these are all experiences that help to bring home for our visitors a little bit of what it was like for our ancestors to go on this removal. They were constantly uncomfortable. They were constantly anxious about what was waiting for them at the end of this removal. And so having this red color helps to bring home that this was a very traumatic experience.
The 3 pieces of gallery that are displayed are replicas of those that were, 2 of which, the male and the female, were inspired by George Winter's art. We have those works of art that are displayed next to that in our narrative panels that you can kind of see where the inspiration came from, but where the details were able to be replicated. The little boy's short shirt was inspired by collections that are held by the Smithsonian. It's a shirt that was collected from Potawatomi people when they lived in Kansas. We just thought that it was appropriate gallery or appropriate way to display all of these in more of like a family setting, a family group, if you will, to show who was being removed, the family groups, whether they be large or small, what they were wearing.
We spent a lot of time trying to go to fabric stores that specialized in 19th century fabrics and patterns, and we chose certain pieces. When Blake Norton and I, my curator, were in Kansas, we were able to see a dress for a young boy that we took really detailed pictures of, and we went to a fabric store and were able to find a piece of fabric that is almost identical to this dress that is from the mid-19th century. And we purchased that, and luckily we have a seamstress that I know pretty well. My mom is a professional seamstress, so we asked her to look at the images of this little boy's dress and use that fabric to try to recreate it as close as possible to the original as we could get. Some of the pieces in that display are actual pieces, are museum pieces from the period. So we actually have a set of children's moccasins that are historic pieces. Most of the pieces that we have are replicas, but we do have a few pieces of each individual's regalia that are pieces that we have acquired through time that are our period pieces, and a few pieces that were made by other tribal members. So it's a really nice mixture of the old, the things that were created by tribal members more recently, and then the things that were created just for this exhibit.
I think the overall goal of the gallery is for people to understand truly what the removal period was about, how long it was, not just the hardships that people had to face, but the individuals that had to walk along it. I think a lot of times more of the individual or the personal experience gets sort of wrapped up in the time period and the overall experience of the tragedy of a removal. So what we really try to do is pull out the individuals, create that human element, especially understanding that our primary visitors are going to be members of the community. So we want them to be able to connect with their ancestors and understand the strength that it took for them to be able to walk through the cultural center that's based upon these mutual pasts and understand that and be prideful of it.
The vast majority of the individuals who did die on the Trail of Death were young children whose immune systems could not withstand the removal. There was not enough clean water, and there were outbreaks of diseases along the way. There was not adequate food for people who were having to walk sometimes 15 to 20 miles a day. So it was a physically exhausting experience, and each one of those deaths was a reminder to the community that they were leaving behind something. They wouldn't be able to return to these graves and properly take care of them. They wouldn't be able to come back to this place and mourn. And so each one of these children, each one of these individuals that were lost along the way, just it is a traumatic thing to have to walk away from everything that you have ever known and everything that your culture tells you is the root of who you are as a people. And I do believe that as our ancestors were walking away and they were having to bury their children, it broke their hearts in a way that we still feel today. When we talk about historic trauma and the things that impact our communities through to this day, the roots of that are in this time period. The roots of that are having to leave behind your culture and your clan animals and the medicines that you used to heal yourself and the bones of your ancestors, including your children.